In this edition of the Talking Toughness podcast series, we welcome Paul Taylor, a former British Royal Navy aircraft officer. Paul is an exercise physiologist, nutritionist and neuroscientist who is currently completing a PhD in applied psychology, where he's developing and testing resilience strategies with the Australian Defence Science Technology Group and the University of Newcastle. Paul is the founder and director of the Mind, Body, Brain Performance Institute, where he delivers resilience, leadership and executive performance programs for an impressive array of global organisations. His latest venture is the Resilient Mind, an online programming app that is currently used by a number of corporations and has proven benefits for resilience and mental well-being of participants. Paul, in fact, runs his own podcast series where we've been guests, so today we turn the tables on him. Welcome, Paul.
Oh, thank you. I actually sound reasonably impressive in that introduction.
Well, you've got some bits and pieces.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah,
all smoke and mirrors.
Firstly, let's go straight to death by comfort. So,
nice way to go.
Premise there?
I think that's my ambition.
Death by comfort. Yeah, it's a very snappy title. What's the core premise, and why do you think that's the case?
So, look, the core premise on it is that our genome hasn't changed in over 45,000 years. And we have a genome that is essentially wired for being a hunter-gatherer. But we have taken that genome and we've plonked it in this modern world where we are not moving anywhere near as much as we should do and actually need to for proper functioning, where our diet has changed to the extent that more than half of the calories that we consume are ultra processed foods, which are really targeting our brain's reward systems, and we end up doing a lot of comfort eating. We also are digitally connected but socially disconnected, and importantly, we are robbing ourselves of these really conserved biological mechanisms that actually make us resilient. And what I mean by conserved biological mechanisms is that you see them across species and across timelines. You see there's a number of different species, from all the way from fruit flies to worms to rodents to primates to humans, that benefit really, really strongly from exposure to stressors such as exercise, cold stress and heat stress. And our modern comfortable environments, we just don't move very much, and we live in thermoneutral environments, and it's robbing us of this stuff that actually drives resilience at a biology level. So a lot of psychologists talk about the psychology of it. And yes, I'm interested in it, but I always say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It needs to interface with the biology as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, that, because, like I say, when we talk about stress, we often think about it purely from a kind of psychological point of view that ignores that huge area of biopsychology. And it's really interesting, because I suppose then those kind of physical stresses that we would encounter are replaced by there's still stress, but it's a different kind of stress, right? Yeah. So when you're managing workloads or a feeling that you need to achieve X, Y, and Z, that would be quite different to sort of what the fireflies and the rodents and the hunter-gatherers are managing, right?
Absolutely. And I think I talk about that quite a lot in my book and in my presentations, is that now we have lots of novel stressors, and if you're listening to this, the alarm going off in the morning is a stressor, right? It's a stress to your cardiovascular system. And if you press snooze, you're getting multiple shocks to your cardiovascular system. But then, we've got to get kids out to school in the morning. We've got to get a fight amongst the traffic, although there's probably not much traffic where you are, John, but lots of us have lots of traffic. Yes, indeed. And then, you've got workplace stress. There's change, workplace change that causes stress. And there's all of these insidious psychological stressors that in and of themselves aren't huge, but it's the cumulative load, right? It's that switching on at low to moderate levels of what are supposed to be emergency systems. So our fight or flight response and our HPA axis. And I always say to people that the human brain is pretty amazing, right? So we could have a pretty deep philosophical conversation about God and religion and science and all of that. And that's really heavy stuff that requires a big brain. We could also have a conversation about metacognition, the fact that you can think about the fact that you can think about stuff, right? And if you're a listener, just think about that for a second. But this amazing brain of ours has a double-edged sword in that primates are the only species, and particularly humans, whose thoughts can activate the stress response system. And that means that we can sit and ruminate about some bullshit that happened 20 years ago or the news that we've just read, and we can create a stress response as if we're being chased by a lion. And we can also catastrophize about something that might happen in the future and often never does, but you'll create that same stress response. All of this is being done almost in absence of hormetic stressors that I mentioned earlier on, which are, so just to cap this off, hormesis is basically sublethal exposure to stressors or toxins, which at high levels can kill you, but at low to moderate levels induce stress resistance. Things like exercise, inoculation, cold, heat. Yeah. And also lots of phytochemicals in food are hormetic polyphenols that we're not eating very much of, and we've replaced them with McDonald's and KFC and crap like that.
Is this an observation about Western society? Because as we travel around the world, we don't see all of these things in every society we come across.
No, I absolutely, Doug, and I should have prefaced it with that. And it's not all of those things happen in all Western societies. If we take the food thing, the worst offenders are the Americans, the Canadians, the Brits, the Kiwis, and the Australians. We eat the way more ultra processed food than the French or the Spanish. But I think globally, if we look at exercise, globally, it tends to be a bit of an issue. There was a big study done, 111 different countries using smartphone data around physical activity patterns. And no country on average got about 7,000 steps a day. The highest was Hong Kong and China at 7,000. The lowest was Indonesia, actually, at 3,500. And if you've ever been in Indonesia and seen the roads in Indonesia, you understand why they don't walk very much. But, Americans, Brits, Australians are all very similar, about 5,000 steps a day. Now, there are other societies such as the Scandinavians who do engage in particularly the heat and the cold stuff. And certainly other societies where they move more and eat a better diet. But we're even seeing in those developing nations that this comfort food is just fast developing. And it's increasing at a rapid rate of knots. And I believe the combination of those things is driving not just our physical ill health, but our mental ill health as well.
Okay. Why do you think people then in Western society are defaulting to processed foods? Is it easier to prepare, easier to get?
It is a bit of that, and it's also a huge amount of what's called the bliss point. So basically, these foods hijack our brain's reward systems and make us want to eat more. So they're called this term called moreish, that I used to think was a made up term, but it actually does exist. So we know the bliss point is certain combinations of fat and sugar, or fat and salt, or sugar and salt, or ideally all three, fat, salt, and sugar. Now, those three, they are the neurobiology of preference. So our brain our hunter-gatherer brain has a natural bent for fat because it's energy dense, for sugar because it's a ready source of available energy, and salt or sodium is necessary for life. And food scientists know this. And so they actually do experiments on the bliss point that actually activates these reward centers in the brain. When you eat it, it tastes amazing and it releases dopamine, and dopamine says, that felt good. Do it again. Have another Pringle, John. And then they add in all these flavors and emulsifiers. An emulsifier is something that makes it feel amazing in your mouth. Just think of cheesecake, right? So they're adding in all of this stuff that is just hijacking our natural reward systems in the brain.
Yeah, you got me craving a nice sort of salted caramel chocolate. I think it's really interesting going back to the idea of the sort of, was you saying that humans would be unique amongst the primates in terms of the metacognition driving physiological stress? And
yes, I believe that we are. Now it's pretty hard to do those experiments on primates because you can't really ask them, right? But the thinking is that our neocortex is more developed and richer, and that we particularly have that ability for metacognition. I'm not sure whether it has been evidenced in other primates or not.
Yeah, my kind of very rudimentary understanding knows about the difference between the evolution of the prefrontal cortex, of course, that primates don't have, and whether that's a source of great metacognition and misery and bad choices. I'm not so sure. But I do find that really interesting. So then, because we're kind of dealing with these cognitive stresses, I've got a to-do list, I've got a deadline, and it's all created, of course. None of these are natural stresses. So then having that kind of day-to-day managing bills and work and family and stuff like that, how does that then have an increase on the, I suppose we use the term allostatic load, like that? That physiological increase. Could you just talk us through that a little?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great point, John. So there's two. So for the listeners, for the benefit of the listeners, I know you know this, but there's two parts to our stress response system. So we have our fight or flight mechanism, fight, flight, or freeze, and that is very, very fast acting. Goes through the nervous system, and the adrenal glands end up producing adrenaline and noradrenaline, and as our American cousins like to call it, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so that is very, very rapid acting, and actually is nature's natural way of dealing with stress. But if the stress is prolonged or very, very intense, then the HPA axis kicks in. So hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex this time. So it's the adrenal glands at the same time, but it's the adrenal cortex this time that produces major stress hormones, glucocorticoids, the major one being cortisol. Now, cortisol, when it's released, in the short term, it's actually a good thing, because if someone was just to burst into your room right now with a gun or attack you or whatever, or the lion chasing our hunter-gatherer ancestor, cortisol's released, and it actually makes your senses keener and sharper. It makes your pupils dilate to take in more information. It dulls your sensitivity to pain in case you get attacked, and it helps to mobilize blood sugar, dumps blood sugar into your system. So in a short term, to deal with an intense stressor, that's really, really useful. But over the long term, cortisol makes you fat, it makes you sick, and it destroys your brain cells. So we know that it particularly can destroy dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine producing brain cells. And so you end up with low levels of these things, which then contribute to mental health disorders. And basically, it's a process that we call excitotoxicity in the frontal lobes, where they're basically getting excited, stimulated to death, and there's too much glutamate and it can basically kill them. And then when a brain cells dies, it spills out a whole heap of other glutamate that then becomes toxic in the brain. And you get this really nasty knock-on effect in the brain. And we're seeing that people who have chronic stress and high allostatic load, that tends to go hand in hand with an enlarged amygdala. And that's pretty amazing, particularly some of the modern studies looking at people who are chronically stressed over time. So, we could follow the three of us and a bunch of listeners, put us in brain scanners every year, ask about the amount of stress in our lives. And you'd see over time, the people who are reporting significant, consistent stress, their amygdala grows bigger and more sensitive. They become hypervigilant, and their frontal lobes actually shrink. And that then means, this is really critical, that you have a brain that is less able to regulate your emotions, because part of the frontal lobes basically are the handbrake for the amygdala. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that largely it's to do with strong emotions, but particularly with threat, fear, and negative emotions.
Yeah, and so I think where that kind of connects so well with the mental toughness side of things, resilience, hardiness, and I understand how you then start moving into applied psych, right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
If we see that as the impact of chronic stress and not appropriately managing chronic stress, then the next logical thing is to say, okay, so I don't want my cortisol levels going up and up and up and leading to reduced dopamine and serotonin and more glutamate in the brain and all that kind of stuff. So what do I do about it? How do I manage those chronic stresses?
Absolutely. And look, this is, if we had the answer to that for everybody, we'd all be multimillionaires. But so for me, it's always I like to take an integrated approach, a mind, body, brain approach to this. Right. So, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So physiologists would tell you it's all about exercise. Nutritionists would tell you it's all about nutrition. Sleep scientists would tell you it's all about sleep. And psychologists would tell you it's all about your mind. But we know that all of those things interact with everything else, right? I think that Western science, since the time of René Descartes and this whole idea of dualism, Western science started to develop this very much Newtonian Cartesian world view, which, as you know, John, having done your PhD, this sort of stuff serves us very well when we're trying to break things down to its smallest component part and understand them. And so science tends to be very siloed, and practitioners are often very siloed, but it misses the fact that we are a ridiculously complex ecosystem. And I often talk about how exercise is not just about how you look, but it helps you to manage stress. It also helps you to sleep as well. And it actually grows volume in your right prefrontal cortex, particularly, which is the seat of willpower in the brain. We also know that if you have a poor night's sleep, your stress hormones are higher the next day. Ghrelin, your hunger hormone, is higher the next day. Leptin is lower, and it has a powerful impact on voluntary physical activity. So you're much more likely to sit around on your arse all day long. You're much less likely to work out. Then you're less able to handle the stresses of the day's events, and you're more likely to end up soothing your anxiety of an evening with a few drinks or crap food. And in both cases, it impacts upon your sleep. And then I could go on and talk about the nutrition but one other thing, when we to just talk about the psychology here and some of the stuff I loved about reading your guys' book and some of the light bulbs going off was particularly around that that challenge aspects of it, and the control aspects, that whole how you view things psychologically. And I had often talked about that. There's beautiful research showing that if you view something as a threat or a stressor, so this is a potential stress, if you view it as threatening or stressful, it activates your HPA axis and cortisol. Whereas if you view it as a challenge, it actually activates your fight or flight mechanism, which is nature's more effective way of dealing with that stress. And so the biology, the physiology, and the psychology do this beautiful dance that can either be a beautiful dance or a horrible wrestling match.
There was I think fascinating, and I think you're so right in terms of the dualism aspect there, Paul, where it is that if you're a hammer, so with dualism we tend to, because most people might only have an expertise in one area, so you tend to look at that. So I suppose that's your unique element. But what you say about the sensing a threat there, I remember a former PhD student of mine, Mark Thompson, works at London Met now. He did a study during his PhD, right, where he had people doing a 16.1k time trial on a stationary bike, and they were given different feedback throughout different points. So they were told if they were in the top whatever, they won stuff, and there was a punishment for those at the bottom. And then they were given feedback halfway through as to where they were, and we measured their cortisol response. And
it was amazing. This already.
I tell you, it was an incredible response, given that they were given one line in something that they weren't particularly passionate about. They're only taking part in a study in a lab in a university. And the threat group were told basically, so if you're in the bottom two, you get a punishment. And they were told something like fifth from bottom or something like that. So essentially they're given this, if you don't pick it up, you're going to finish in the bottom. So they're given a threat state. Whereas those who were told you're fifth from the top, and of course we were just lying, it was all like we do because we're psychologists.
Yes.
So they saw it as an opportunity to, if I improve, I can win something, rather than I can steer clear of something. And their cortisol went in opposite directions.
Interesting.
What was also interesting, the ones who were told you're currently in the top two, their cortisol was more similar to the threat group, because they were doing well, but it was a sense of, I've got something that I need to hold on to here.
Yeah.
And I tell you what really struck me about that is, this is not something that people were really invested in. This is not something they've worked years for. This is just a random study. And they were given one line of feedback, literally like 5 words. And that's the impact. And I thought, imagine then if that stressor, that threat, is not just one line of feedback to something that's unimportant, but it's constant and it's daily and it's about something that actually matters. You think, geez, what would the impact be over a long period of time there? I don't think we'd get ethics to do it for years.
No, definitely.
That's why they use rats.
Yes, indeed. But it is fascinating how our psychology affects our biology and how our biology affects our psychology.